Master, the 49th main range Big Finish Doctor Who release and the third part of the classic Villains trilogy, first released in 4 parts across CD and download on the 31st of October, Halloween, 2003, and written by Joseph Lidster. The classic Villains trilogy started off with the likes of Omega, continued through with Davros, and now we have Master. And I think out of the 3, this one is probably the least complicated, but at the same time, I think it's probably my favourite, purely because it is the least complicated out of everything. It gives us a fairly basic story about redemption and trying to work out if good or bad are interchangeable, and I think it does actually do really well. So what's the setup? You've got an assassin, voiced by Daniel Barzotti, who is about to kind of assassinate someone, when he is suddenly stopped by the Doctor, the 7th Doctor, voiced once again by Sylvester McCoy. To which the Doctor, in an attempt to stop the man from his mission, tells him a story about a great man named Dr. John Smith, and how he was a friend of his, and how he ultimately had to come to grips with what he had done. Now, the story takes place, for the most of the part, in a place called Perfugium. It's kind of like a human colony in the far future, where Dr. John Smith, voiced by Geoffrey Beevers, he's a man who's done a lot of good for the people of Perfugium, and on his birthday he invites around 2 of his friends, adjudicator Victor Schaefer, voiced by Philip Maddock, and his wife Jacqueline Schaefer, voiced by Anne Riddler. And Victor and Jacqueline, they've come to accept Dr. John Smith for who he is. I mean, they do understand that he is very he's got scars, literally, his face is almost practically melted, but they have come to understand that he is a good man, he can be a great man, and he has done a lot of good for his community. So they join him along with his housekeeper, or scullery maid Jade, voiced by Charlie Hayes. However, mysterious voices are whispering all over the house. They're voiced by Gary Russell. And eventually, the Doctor shows up at the house, and they must unravel a mystery of mysterious murders happening around the place, with it eventually being discovered, spoiler alert if you yet listen to the story, that Victor is actually the murderer. But the Doctor has more of an underlying mission at hand, because it turns out that Dr. John Smith is actually his old nemesis, the Master. As I said, voiced by Geoffrey Beevers. And the Doctor is there mainly because, well, I'm going to have to go into spoilers here anyway, but I'm going to have to spoil a big part here. Jade, Dr. John Smith's scullery maid, turns out to actually be Death. And while they're trying to work everything out, it turns out that the Doctor made a deal with Death in order to try and save the Master's soul. Like, believing that the Master could still turn good, the Doctor was essentially allowed to place the Master inside a simulation where the Master had no idea who he was. He was going to live out 10 years as Dr. John Smith and see if he ultimately could turn out to be good, turn out to be a good person. However, it gradually becomes more and more complicated for Dr. John Smith in his mind once he finds out that he is also this being known as the Master. Because the question of, yes, he knows he's done good for Perfugium, but then it does also become a question of, am I doing these things because I truly am good, or am I doing these things because I want to fool people because I genuinely am evil? Like, it does become a bit of a war of two sides with him, as the Doctor then has to kind of give him the opportunity to either murder Victor for murdering other people around Perfugium, or whether the Master can find another way to spare Victor's life, or eventually just go on being the Master. And while it's still a little bit complicated, but not as complicated as the other two, and I do think that this is, I think, the best story of the classic Villains trilogy. I mean, Omega I thought was alright, if a little bit dull, Davros, I felt, was a pretty good story, but it does get a little bit complicated. This one I actually do feel is the simplest. It does have some complicated moments, but it's not really complicated in that you can't really understand what's going on. It's more that you can understand what's going on, but there's a question of two sides, a battle of ethics. Like, do we do good things because we're legitimately good, or do we do good things to fool people? And it does get you asking questions more and more. It turns out that the assassin who the Doctor has been talking to, voiced by Daniel Barzotti, is also just another form of death. And the Doctor kind of has to accept that he's going to meet up with Death again, that this isn't a one-time meeting. As Death knows that she'll be able to trick the Doctor someday, the Doctor really hopes he'll be able to get out of it for as long as possible. But there you go, there's my quick little review of the Doctor Who Big Finish story, Master. Now, the next Big Finish review I've got coming up is a big one. It's the 50th story, Zagreus. What do I think of that? Well, we'll just have to wait and see. Till next time, adios.